Move on 2 minutes ahead of time to the next program item, and that is moving on to the data and data analysis. And we're starting with a presentation about data and data analysis on gender-based violence in the sports institution. And I'm going to hand over to Laure Humbert, who's a professor at Oxford Brookes University, to introduce you to this session. And Anne, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit more, since we are recording and this might be an independent slot in the recording? So pretend that you are completely new in this room when you start talking, if okay.
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you for the invitation to be here today virtually online together. My name is Professor Laure Humbert. I am working at Oxford Brookes University in the UK, although I am currently a visiting professor at the University of Gothenburg. I'm a professor of gender and statistics, so what I do is measure all sorts of inequalities and just try and make sense of data, so just at all stages of the data life cycle, going from collection to analysis, and in particular using intersectional perspectives. I have been invited here because of my role working in different projects. In particular, I would like to mention the UNICEF project, which was a Horizon project which finished recently, where we were looking at addressing gender-based violence in research performing organizations. And the UNICEF project is continuing on through GenderSafe, which is a new project which has recently started, where we're going to be continuing this work, and in particular looking at developing and testing a code of conduct and looking at zero tolerance approaches to gender-based violence, again, in research organizations. Another project I wanted to mention is the project Gearing Roles, because the project Gearing Roles was similar to what you are doing with the Supporter project, in that it is a CSA project, so a structural change project. So we had this project running from 2019 to 2024, and we were 6 organizations as part of this throughout Europe implementing gender equality plans. So as part of this, within Oxford Brookes University, I was working on developing and implementing our own gender equality plans. And that led to me doing a lot of work on data collection and data analysis, specifically for the purpose of achieving gender equality in our organizations, and in particular on gender-based violence. And then another aspect of my work that I would like to mention is that I very often collaborate with a consultancy called Equal Insights, where we are working with other universities and other research organizations and helping them with all aspects of data collection and data analysis. So that has given us a lot of experience and expertise when it comes to working with universities such as yourselves when it comes to data collection and data analysis. So what I want to do today is I want to do 3 things. And throughout the day, throughout the program, we are going to first have a discussion about the relevance of gender-based violence in higher education, and in particular in the context, in your context, that of the sport environment. So in this, I am not an expert on the sport environment, but it was very interesting for me to have a little bit of a reflection of how gender-based violence was relevant to that. And I will show you what I think are just aspects that are worth considering when we're looking at specifically addressing gender-based violence in these types of institutions. And then later on during the program of today's training, we will have 2 separate slots. So one which is going to focus more specifically on data collection and one on data analysis. So for some of you, it might be a revision of concepts that you have seen before, For some of you, it might be just something that is very new. And my aim is to give you as much information as possible for inspiration. So there is no expectation that you necessarily take up everything that I'm going to be talking about, but that at least you have some awareness of what exists, what is possible, and that you use that as a source of inspiration for your own implementation of your gender equality plans and your own measures in your institutions to address the gender-based violence. So I will start with talking a little bit about the context of the sports environment. Let me share my screen now. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
It's not in full view, whatever the word is. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So when I was thinking specifically about the context of gender-based violence in relation to the sport environment, what really struck me is the fact that there have been a number of very, very high profile cases, including athletes and coaches that have received significant media attention and that have prompted a public discourse. And here, just like not knowing very much about the sports environment myself, I very much followed what happened in 2021 when the sailor Sofia Beketoru in Greece started talking about her experience of abuse in relation to her sport activities, and how this, in the context of Greece, really sparked a lot of debates and started an entire movement discussing the issue of gender-based violence more generally in society. So if you are interested in following up on this, just my slides will be available, and you can follow the link if you want to just read more about this. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. What we see in relation to gender-based violence in the sports environment is that it's something that is just really, really widespread and with very serious consequences. So something that also strikes me about this sports environment is that it is an environment that is highly structured and competitive. And I have been doing a lot of work thinking about gender equality in the context of academic institutions and universities. And in some ways, I'm observing something that is similar. So if you think about academic careers, we have something that is also functioning in this very highly structured and competitive environment. And these departments in the context of universities, but when we're talking about sports, means that we have to understand gender-based violence in the context of governing bodies, of leagues and teams and so on. And that because there is this really, really highly structured aspect to this environment, it might create a lot of stigma. It might create a lot of fears of retaliation. And it creates also some power dynamics within sporting organizations. So by which I think it creates not only the potential for violence to happen, but also for nothing to be done in relation to addressing what is happening, preventing it from happening in the first place. And then I think just for athletes, just like in academic careers, it's a form of elite professional setting. And this is just something that is very, very competitive. So there are very much the case of additional barriers to reporting. And that's the case, for example, when people are very concerned about their career repercussions of the negative publicity. And the fact that you have a competitive environment where there are very few places where it is about just being the best and just competing just for the top spots, if I can put it like this. You probably will want to just avoid just having something that is rocking the boat. So in just all of this really can create an environment that is not preventing gender-based violence and may in fact encourage it. What I think we need to talk about also is the aspect of the normalization of violence. And here, in the context of sports, I think that certain forms of violence, such as bullying or abusive coaching practices, might be something that is normalized or that is justified in the sports culture. So again, you probably know more than I do about this, but what I would guess is the fact that we see in coaching is that there is a degree of toughness, and the degree of which toughness just spills over into abusive behavior might be a bit of a gray area. Although I just would argue that just abuse remains abuse, and there is just no justification for that type of bullying. So different forms of violence are likely to be prevalent in that type of environment. And when we talk about violence, it's not only bullying. So bullying being, for example, a form of psychological violence. But there may be other instances worth talking about. So physical violence, sexual violence, or even economic violence, which we might see in the context of sports. And if we don't challenge this normalization of violence within the practices in the sports sector, it can contribute to an underestimation of the actual prevalence of violence in that particular environment. I also thought it was worth talking about power dynamics, because like other organizations, it also struck me that there was sometimes very hierarchical structures in sport organizations. And there are some people that hold the power. They hold the ability to decide who is just going to be attending a certain event, a certain competition, who is going to be selected for something, and that creates a lot of imbalances. So there's also the idea of authority figures within this, because there are very often very close relationships just during many years with coaches or other authority figures. And that is something that we need to be mindful of, because when it comes to gender-based violence, there is the potential for this to inhibit reporting and data collection efforts. I also thought it was worth thinking about the fact that athletes may feel pressure to remain silent or to defer authority, even in the face of abusive behavior, because challenging those power imbalances might be very difficult. And then I wanted to talk about intersectional factors more specifically. So when I talk about intersectionality, I'm talking about the idea that different aspects of our identities, so socio-demographic factors such as our sex, our gender, our race, our abilities, are going to possibly multiply and intersect to create multiple inequalities. But I don't want you to think of intersectionality as being only a combination of individual level characteristics. I think it's also really important to think of intersectionality as being something that is about structural power inequalities. And this is all the more relevant given what I've been talking about in the context of gender-based violence in sport organizations. So the reasons that we might experience as individuals multiple inequalities is just related to structural inequalities at societal level in a wider sense. So we are just really talking about discrimination and minoritization, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism, all of which I think are very relevant in the context of sport. You will perhaps notice that I talk about minoritized groups rather than minorities. And that is, again, just talking about the extent to which certain groups are subject to power relations and are just experiencing discrimination as a result of power inequalities. So that we can have, for example, minoritized groups that are not, in fact, a numerical minority. And the best example of that is just to talk about women that are often a minoritized groups, although they are in society not a minority. So just the work that I have been doing and I want to discuss with you today is just how can we collect and analyze data on gender-based violence so that we can inform actions that we want to take in our organizations, while considering these intersecting identities. And I want you to just keep in mind that we have to pay careful attention all the time to the complex interactions between different axes of oppression and privilege. So at this point, stop sharing. So I want to stress that I am not an expert on sport organization, but it was just very interesting for me to be able to reflect and apply the knowledge that I have in other contexts to the context of sport organization. And I think it's just like in this part of the program, it would be really good to hear some reflections from you who are really experts in this domain and to see whether any of the topics that I have mentioned resonate with your experiences. And maybe Natalie can just tell you more about the group work that we have in mind for you.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Laure. So yes, this first session is about gender-based violence in the specific context of sport. And as Laure explained, I mean, there are different aspects to consider, and you can have really also different forms of gender-based violence. And we would like you all and us all to go into subgroups and just discuss examples that we have. I mean, there are obviously some well-known examples coming in the press about, you know, very, I mean, physical violence between coach and athlete, for example, but also other forms of perhaps misogynist comments from coaches in some types of sports, you know, like you also have some homophobic stance in football, for example. So if you can so we will do groups, random groups, so we are not by institution, nothing like that. It's just to share examples that we know about types of violence. And as Laure has explained, there are different types. It can be economic, it can be physical, it can be psychological. Just think all the type of violence that you have seen or known about. So I will just ask Andrea to put us in small groups, and then we will continue the discussion there. Is there any questions before we do break? Well, that's clear. That's okay. Anyway, we will be there. Each of us will be there, so we can also talk through this again in the subgroup. I think it's good, Andrea. Thank you.
Portion in the sample of data that we collect. To ensure that you have diverse representation in a sample, there are different things you can do. The first one is to use what we call purposeful sampling. And this is a method where you actively seek out participants from various demographic groups to ensure representation across different identities, such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomic background. So this is similar to adopting a quota approach, where you just make sure that you have sufficient representation from different groups. But a better way, if you can do it, is to use what is called stratified sampling. And stratified sampling is something that is better because it is something where you are taking a random selection among different strata, so among different groups. You're going to stratify the sample according to relevant demographic variables, such as gender, race, and socioeconomic status. And within these groups, you're going to ensure proportional representation of different groups within the university population. However, it might not be practical to do that because to stratify the sample is something that is not always possible. In the UNICEF survey, for example, we did the pilot at Oxford Brookes University, and what we did is we sent an email to all staff and students. However, it would not have been possible to create different groups of email by different characteristics. So in this case, it would be more appropriate to just use something like purposive sampling if we had wanted to increase the representation of certain groups. Within these two methods, we are talking about having an approximate sample that represents the proportion we see in staff and students, but you might want to do something slightly different, which is to oversample. So where we have very small groups, so for example, on disability, it might be necessary to just try and increase the responses from this group in order to be able to say something more meaningful and avoid having a cell count that is too small. We cannot say very much and do much analysis if we don't have enough responses for certain groups. And of course, when we do intersectional analysis, and the more we just take multiple grounds into account, the smaller the categories might get. So again, here I want you to be left with the idea of purposeful sampling and stratified sampling, and for you to do research these concepts more if you were going to use them in your own institution. You also need to think about inclusive recruitment, and here to think about strategies to reach minoritized and underrepresented groups. And ideas for doing that might be to partner up with students or staff organizations. So examples of this, I would suggest unions, societies, staff committees that can engage participants from different backgrounds. Here, telling you about our experience at Oxford Brookes University is the union, the student union, is very actively engaged with the topic of gender-based violence. But we also have among our staff, we have some staff committees working on race equality that are very useful to try and oversample if we wanted to reach this particular group of people. Of course, when we talk about data collection methods, we need to talk about the different types of variables, data and information that you're going to be able to have. And the first type of data that you need to think about is what is called administrative data. So these are data that might already exist in your organization. They're already collected for the same purpose as what you want to use it for, or for a different purpose. What you need to do is to map where these different data sources might be and liaise with the people responsible for that. So what you might have and what exists in many institutions is data on the number of incidents, the type and number of incidents of gender-based violence that were reported, with outcomes and other information. You need to keep in mind that there might be different people or units for different groups or for different types of incidents. So again, here, giving you the example of my own institution at Oxford Brookes University, the administrative data we have on gender-based violence tends to be split and be located in different units, depending on whether we are talking about incidents that concern staff or that concern students. And this is something that I've seen in many other institutions, so that may very well apply to you. And what you also need to map are the different characteristics that are recorded alongside these data. If you want to think about these data in terms of intersectionality, then you need to look at that other information that allow you to have more granularity. And finally, here on this slide, I have put a link to an annual report as an inspiring practice if you wanted to see how another institution is using administrative data and reporting it. So we've talked about administrative data, but I also want to talk a little bit about surveys and questionnaires, which are seen as another type of data. And an approach that you may want to have if you decide to collect data on gender-based violence in your institution is to administer a survey of questionnaires that include questions on gender-based violence, on the experiences of people in relation to incidents, on the consequences that it has, and so on. And that includes variables to measure intersecting identities. Here, you might want to ask yourself whether this is going to be a standalone survey. For example, in Oxford Brookes University, we did one as part of the pilot for the UNICEF project. And we did this as part of the Gearing Roles project, which was another structural change project, which we were working on as part of implementing a gender equality plan in our institution. However, we might have chosen to put some extra questions into existing surveys. In my institution, we have regular surveys that are looking at staff opinion on a range of different issues and to try and not only increase the well-being of our staff, but also just to think about different type of inequalities we may have. Of course, in doing that, you need to ask yourself, are those surveys and questionnaires going to be able to equally reach staff and students? In the example that I've just given you, for example, embedding question into our regular staff surveys would not be sufficient to collect data on students. So there might be a need for different strategies in this case. You can just click on this link after this online session, and you can have a look at the final UNICEF survey questionnaire, should you wish to start a survey of your own or take any of the questions to adapt them and put them into an existing, more general survey. You might also want to consider other types of data which are not quantitative, but qualitative in nature. And for example, through interviews and focus groups. And here you could conduct qualitative interviews of focus groups to gather in-depth narratives and insights into the intersectional dynamics of gender-based violence. And that is very useful if you want to allow participants to share their experiences and perspectives in their own words. By having something which is more narrative in nature, we are often able to pick up on different aspects of discrimination related to intersectionality and just really have lived, embodied experiences that we can use to understand the problem of gender-based violence in our institutions. Consider using visual methods and creative methods as well. And here I can give you the example of the University of Northampton in the UK that was doing a project looking with their students at safe spaces and asking students to come into focus groups with images of settings on campus that were not safe. And asking, using that as a prop for further conversations and having a focus group on what measures could be put in place to address gender-based violence in their own context. You can also have a look at this really useful material taken from the UNICEF project, which is a facilitating guide if you wanted to use some of these methods to collect data in your own institution, and which is very useful. And finally, you might want to think about a mixed methods approach. So using both quantitative and qualitative methods in what is called triangulation. So we talk about when we use findings from quantitative and qualitative data collection methods. And the idea behind triangulation is that we get a more comprehensive understanding of gender-based violence and intersectional dimensions because we're able to get insights from multiple perspectives and multiple sources of data. Always think about the ethical considerations that are behind any data collection efforts. One aspect of that is, of course, informed consent. Make sure that you obtain informed consent from your participants. Ensure that they understand the purpose of the study, their rights, and the potential risks of benefits of participation. And this is particularly important in the context of a sensitive topic like gender-based violence. Make sure that you apply for ethics approval ahead of doing any data collection. And again, because of the very sensitive nature of the topic of gender-based violence and the potential that there is to trigger your respondents. Make sure that you ensure confidentiality and privacy in data collection. And this is important, particularly when you're collecting sensitive information about gender-based violence. Implement data security measures to safeguard participants' identities and minimize the risk of re-victimization or harm. And here it's not only the fact that gender-based violence is something that is very sensitive, but also if you want to look at this from an intersectional perspective, you want to prevent the risk of re-identification if you take two small categories. And then finally, the principle of minimizing harm, which in this field is very important. When you conduct research on gender-based violence, you really need to have a careful ethical considerations on minimizing harm to your participants, ensuring their autonomy and well-being, and that these are prioritized, especially because we are exploring sensitive and traumatic experiences. So here, recognize and keep in mind that the topic of gender-based violence can be triggering. When we ask people about their experiences, they might just remember and be re-traumatized by the questions themselves. So it is very important to ensure that you provide information to your participants about where they can get support if they need it. And also think about the needs of researchers and secondary trauma. This is not something that we talk about enough, but we have to also take care of ourselves, just dealing with these issues and the potential that we have to be traumatized. So secondary traumatization that we can have as a result of encountering the experiences of others. This is something that in research in this field, you might see referred to as vicarious trauma. So think about the needs of researchers. So for example, even having a safe space and an exchange of experiences between researchers in this might be helpful as a first step. And then finally, I want to leave you with some challenges and consideration if you decide to do data collection on gender-based violence in your institution. First, I would like to encourage you to think about data quality and bias. So make sure that the quality and reliability of the data you collect on gender-based violence, particularly when exploring sensitive and stigmatized experiences, can be challenging. Some of the issues which we've discussed previously is the problem of achieving a representative sample that captures a diversity of experiences across different intersecting identities, but particularly among certain groups that are minoritized or excluded from participation. So what you might find is that some groups, even though they are represented in the institution, might be less likely to respond or to participate in any data collection that you're doing. But you might also see bias happening when certain groups are more likely to respond. For example, women, if they feel more concerned about the topic than men. In the UNICEF survey, we saw this. So it's a survey. The main survey itself was implemented among 46 institutions across Europe, and we received 42,000 responses. But what we saw is that even though we would expect that the population of students and staff in those institutions would be approximately 50-50, what we saw was much more responses from women than from men. And this, we think, is because the title of Survey on Gender-Based Violence meant that women felt much more concerned with the topic than men and were therefore more likely to respond. So what we did then is we applied a statistical technique where we reweight the answers. So that might be something that you also need to consider and think about in your own work. Finally, you need to think a little bit about the problem of underreporting and consider that gender-based violence incidents are very often underreported due to stigma, due to fear of retaliation, and a lack of trust in institutional responses. So when we collect data, we do not know whether that corresponds to the actual rates of incidents of gender-based violence, or if that only corresponds to the disclosed incidents and experiences of gender-based violence. And often what we theorize is that what we're able to capture through data collection is only the tip of the iceberg, and that it is very likely that there are many more incidents of gender-based violence than what we are able to capture through data collection. And then to bear in mind that intersectional factors such as race, gender identity, immigration status, might further exacerbate those barriers to disclosure, so that the underreporting might be even more pronounced in those settings. So I will leave it here for the presentation, and I will then welcome any questions you may have on this and a wider discussion on these topics.